morning, everyone. Thank you for having us. It is my absolute pleasure to moderate what I'm sure will be a brilliant discussion between Nadine Strossen and David French on the state of free speech in the United States. By way of brief introduction to how we'll spend our hour together, I do promise to try to leave at least 10 minutes for questions, maybe a little more, because your questions are often the most fun part of these panels. So please be thinking of anything that you want to ask. And I think, we spoke a bit this week about how we wanted to approach the panel. And we agreed, there are times in which this particular panel would focus a lot on law. Right, the state of free speech in America, right? What's going on at the Supreme Court? What's going on in the courts? What laws are being passed or not? And following directly from the last panel, we settled on the fact that actually law will come up today for sure, but we're going to orient our conversation a little bit more around the issues and around the interrelation between law and culture in the U.S. right now, and how much that is impacting sort of the state of free speech. I'm going to throw out a bunch of issues that I think should be on the table. I want you guys to add to them, agree, disagree as to whether or not they are real fault lines in free speech today. So we can say what we might want on academic freedom. We just had a whole panel on that, but of course that's obviously a big issue. Disinformation across the board. We are approaching an election, maybe you heard, and the role of disinformation on both sides, especially in the political realm, I think is something that is very concerning right now. I would say a lot of people would put on the table a quite toxic and even dangerous online speech environment, especially for women, minorities. And what do we think? Is that anything new? What do we think about that? But I'm sure a lot of people would put that on the table. In line with that, platform dominance over speech. How concerning is that? Broadening out from platform, private dominance over speech generally, right? Private businesses, private universities. We live in a very, most of our spaces are private in this country. And when the First Amendment doesn't extend to private actors, how concerning is it to give private actors so robust free speech rights? And what does that do to those operating in those spaces? A media environment that is problematic on both sides, to say the least. And many others. But let me kind of set the scene by saying I think a lot of people would at least mention all those issues when we're thinking about the kaleidoscope of free speech today. And I'll offer one last word before turning it to your responses, which is, when I was thinking about this panel today, I was thinking about disaggregating, the state of free speech in the United States. And you can think about those two words separately, right? How free is speech? But then what is the health of our speech in general as well? And I guess I would offer that I think speech actually is quite free right now. I think it's one of the freest it's been. But I also think our speech is quite impoverished right now. And I wonder, it might be one of the most impoverished it's also ever been. Of course, we always think everything's worse in the moment. So maybe I'm being reactive. But let me take that comment, maybe I'm being reactive comment, to turn it over to you all who have been thinking about these issues for decades, and ask you first, generally, what do you think is the state of free speech today? Is it better, worse, relatively speaking, than before? And what issues do you think are at the forefront, whether it's something I named or it's something else, that are most concerning to you? Nadine, why don't I start with you and then go to David?
Well, it's true that we had this wonderful brainstorming conversation to plan, in some sense, our conversation here. But Francesca, I swear that only as you were coming to the end of your wonderful introduction, when you said, what is the state of free speech? Is it good? Is it bad? And what popped into my head for the first time were the famous opening lines in A Tale of Two Cities. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. And, as David and I were coming up here, I flashed back to the last time I had the privilege of sharing the podium with him. And by the way, I really love your column, so I read the latest one this morning. Fan mail, too. But the last time we had the privilege, I had the privilege of sharing the podium with David was a little bit more than 3 years ago. And I asked him, do you think that things are better now or worse now in terms of free speech than they were 3 years ago? And you said, I think a little bit better. And I think the same way. Not only because I'm a congenital optimist, you can't be an activist without it, but to quote Cornel West, optimism is more a product of activism than its cause, more a consequence. And this conference and another conference that's taking place today at the University of Virginia, also, major conference on free speech, and the wonderful Future of Freedom project that Jakob has brought here and found such a wonderful home and doing such great work. The fact that we have free speech unions from the Antipodes that have come here. The fact that FIRE, which under David's great leadership was confined to college campuses, important as that is, but in the last few years has expanded to the larger world. We have a whole host of fairly new organizations, Heterodox Academy, the Academic Freedom Alliance, among others. There has been such a pushback against the perceived and well-publicized erosions on free speech. And that, one manifestation was referred to in the last panel, and that's institutional neutrality. I swear, until as recently as 2 or 3 years ago, most people hadn't even heard of the Calvin principles or institutional neutrality. And now they're spreading like wildfire. So I think that things have gotten quite dire, that they have raised a lot of concern because we Americans, despite our strong disagreements on political issues, I guess we're split 50-50 pretty much between the two major political parties, so that's about as divided as you can be, and yet we have this pride in free speech. I mean, people consider, you talk about the flag, I think most people are at least as patriotic about free speech and have as much pride in preserving it, exercising it, and promoting it, and that's a really positive thing. Now, if I can say what I think the greatest challenge is, that is reining in the forces that are not subject to First Amendment constraints. I'm very optimistic about all of those government inroads on free speech that have been raised by the other speakers. And Suzanne mentioned all the book banning, and Jeffrey Sachs mentioned the California law and the Indiana law. There are lawsuits that are challenging all of those by FIRE, by the ACLU, by PEN America, and other organizations. And for all of their differences on many issues, the United States Supreme Court justices are quite strongly united across that diverse ideological spectrum in strongly protecting free speech. So I'm ultimately confident that the legal challenges will prevail. But what's much more intractable is what do we do about the tech giants, for those of us who think they also have First Amendment rights and should have them. What do we do about the culture, a culture that is so ingrained, as Musa pointed out, that by the time you get tenure, you've already been acculturated to self-censorship.
I'm not going to depart too much from your thoughts at all. I mean, I would just, if I had to boil it down, it would be 4 words: law good, culture bad. Or maybe 5 words: law good, culture mostly bad. The law good part. It's, as Nadine said, my goodness, when you're a First Amendment litigator, you just basically win. I think DJ Khaled, some of you might know, he's a hip hop artist. He wrote a song. Little people don't really know about this. He wrote a song about First Amendment litigation. It was a hit. It goes, all I do is win, 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 and that's the reality. I mean, at the Supreme Court, I mean, we're even at the sort of the reach goals portion of First Amendment litigation. Hey, a middle school cheerleader is angry that she can't complain about her coach on Snapchat. Yeah, let's take that one to the Supreme Court. You know, it's just win after win. Just a few days ago, the 11th Circuit struck down some restrictions on speech before school boards, where they had clamped down on Moms for Liberty, for example, while allowing other parents much more free reign. This just keeps happening. So we are in a position where the law is as good as it's ever been. Culturally, however, we are the cancel culture of the late 20-teens is still clinging to us somewhat. But I think the piece that I am more concerned about is the big tech platform piece. And I fully agree with the Supreme Court in Moody versus Net Choice that these large entities they have their own free speech rights. Their algorithm is expressive, absolutely. And so I do think that there should be a hands-off approach, that the government should not be intervening with Facebook and Twitter, telling them how to moderate their speech. But at the same time, Facebook and Twitter can and should be held accountable by the public and the market if it is engaging in activity that is inhibiting or impairing the culture of free speech in the United States. And we've seen this movie before, by the way. These are big private research universities, have always, for example, had their own free speech rights. They've been much more free than, say, the University of Michigan or UT Austin, which is not the real UT, or UT Knoxville, which is the real UT. The big private research universities, your Harvards, et cetera, we've always had this understanding that they have their own free speech rights, but we urge them in the court of public opinion, we urge them in sort of the marketplace of academic ideas that they should be at least as open to free speech as the government is. The line that we used at FIRE for years was, you don't want to have to go to Bunker Hill Community College for more free speech than you get at Harvard. And so I think that's a similar message for the big platforms. Now, where I think that we might find something very interesting is the platforms might get what they've demanded in court and regret it in this sense. They've been demanding for a long time, well, my algorithm is my speech, or moderation is my speech. And the courts are likely to say, yes, the algorithm is your speech. Well, now what if you algorithmically boost misinformation? What if you algorithmically boost disinformation? That's your speech now, right? That's your speech. Does that mean that Twitter could be liable for defamation if through its speech it is algorithmically boosting disinformation? These are questions that I think we're going to be encountering, we're going to be seeing answers to pretty soon. We recently had a case in Third Circuit, I believe, involving the blackout challenge with TikTok. And this was a situation where a young girl saw the blackout challenge, which is a choking game that was boosted algorithmically into her feed, went home, tried the blackout game, and died, as many young people have. And the question then is, if that's TikTok's speech algorithmically that is boosting it, what responsibility does TikTok have? And a 3-judge panel, which included 2 Trump appointees and 1 Obama appointee, unanimously said, TikTok, let's take a look. And they didn't hold TikTok liable, but they said it is a question. And I think that is going to be a very interesting next frontier where culture collides with law. If this is the tech giant's speech, how responsible for that speech are we going to hold them?
I know we're going to have an entire distinguished panel on social media issues, so we probably don't want to get too much into the weeds on it, but I'm not sure if they're going to discuss what I think is, to me, an extremely concerning issue, and I'm uneasy. This is one area where I'm not such a great fan of what the Supreme Court has done so far, and that is when government pressures the social media companies so that it is not at all clear that it is an independent editorial judgment by these private platforms. There seems to have been a lot of evidence, thanks to the Twitter files and the Facebook files, that what was ostensibly a voluntary decision by private platforms was in effect the result of government coercion, resulting in government delegating to the private sector censorship decisions that would have been flatly unconstitutional if they had been clearly and expressly engaged in by the government itself. You may remember that in September, Mark Zuckerberg sent a letter to Congress in which he essentially apologized for having capitulated to government pressure and said that he would not do that in the future. But I'm not so confident because the incentives are so strong to placate those who have so much regulatory power over the companies, and they are, as a matter of law, only responsible to their shareholders. So where's the constituency on the part of the users of the platform, those who want to speak on it, receive speech from it? We have to somehow raise our voices as consumers, as you suggest, David.
So let me play half moderator, but as we discussed, half dissenter in the spirit of the conference, and invite you guys to push you both on these positions a little bit. A couple things to hear your responses to. So law good, both of you, I think are pretty happy with the, I'm going to term it a very maximalist court in terms of the First Amendment. You mentioned two cases, but one of them was the cheerleader case. It's one of the only cases where you might say the average Joe or average Jane, right, made it to the court and won. But for the most part, yes, the free speech challenges always win at the court, but who's winning, right? It is the tech giants, it is major corporations, it's the pharmaceutical companies, it's major employers, and when those entities are winning in their free speech rights, right? What kind of trickle-down effect does that have to the employee, to the average voter, to the to the normal person? So are people's free speech rights really being vindicated in these cases? That's okay. Let me say point one, and because then I know you could run away with that. Just point two on the tech giant, because I want you to respond to all of this. On the pressure point, I guess it's the same question, right? Where it's like a lot of our case law and a lot of our culture that says, absolutely we don't want the government pressuring us in our speech. That's just as bad as censorship because it's the big bad government. Is it the big bad government when it comes to Twitter and Facebook and TikTok, right? These are giant, powerful entities that have really every resource at their disposal to push back on the government. And if you think about the government in a liberal democracy, is the government not just, hopefully, when everyone's doing their best, actually vindicating the rights of average citizens, and then the tussle between them is just the tussle of a normal, normal factions in a hopefully functional democracy. Hopefully, so take those two, both of you. What would you say to that pushback? Which I think you've both encountered this type of pushback before.
I'm going to agree with you when it comes to the government pressure on the tech giants. I have never really bought into this narrative of poor Meta. If you look at a lot of what happened, you would see mid-level staffers, low-level staffers writing aggressive emails to multinational corporations worth $500 billion and who have legal staffs that can match the DOJ pound for pound, right? So I I do not like jawboning as a matter of principle on the one hand. I also know that our citizens often elect members of the government for the purpose of articulating particular values and ideas. That's part of the democratic process. Is we want people to not just make policy proposals, we also want public officials to make arguments about values in the public square. So I'm absolutely, when it comes to jawboning a large multinational corporation, I never found that nearly as convincing as, say, for example, the NRA versus Vullo case. This is a case where state officials for New York were trying to pressure the NRA by pressuring banks that they regulated. These were banks that they regulated not to do business with the NRA. Created some people did cut off business with the NRA. And in that circumstance, you could draw a direct line between the regulator, the regulated entity, the viewpoint discrimination, and the Supreme Court in Ino, who had on their bingo card Justice Sotomayor writing a majority opinion for the National Rifle Association, said, look, that's, you've got a direct line. Whereas in the Missouri case involving the tech platforming, many of the people complaining weren't even pointing to the specific action regarding their own speech. And so I have a different view of that when it comes to the jawboning these giant multinational corporations. I view the government and these corporations much more in parity than many other people do. So I tend to agree with you on that point. But are normal people getting their rights vindicated? I mean, do normal people feel like they can speak? I think, if you talked to an alien who was visiting, who just come to America and said, we have a free speech problem in this country, they would say, what are you talking about? More idiots speak more loudly in this place than anywhere I've ever visited in the galaxy. And I would say,
none of those idiots are on stage.
No. And I would say, and one of the answers to that is, that's actually kind of the problem. Because one of the dynamics that we have in this country is that the speech environment has become so toxic that we're creating a sort of 1/3, 2/3 dynamic for political participation. About 1/3 of people feel perfectly free, happy, love it, can't wait to get in the fray. And then about 2/3 are this exhausted majority, that they're not a part of dialogue, they're not a part of discussion. And then the more toxic things get in the online space, the larger that exhausted majority gets. That's a cultural problem. It's a cultural problem. And one of the ways that we deal with it is by trying to use the powers of persuasion, and those of us who do lean in, who are not part of that toxic minority, to address that toxic minority and combat it in the marketplace of ideas, to stand up for decency, to stand up for civility. There's a free speech argument for decency and civility, for example. I think sometimes in the free speech world, we've kind of looked askance at those words, decency and civility, because they've been used as pretext for censorship. But if we establish everyone's got free speech rights here, then the moral argument for decency in the public square, in my view, is a moral argument for expanding the public square. And then one last thing on regular folks. Regular folks do still win some. We just had the Villarreal case in the Supreme Court, which is a citizen journalist using a big tech platform, Facebook, and who was prosecuted criminally for calling a public official to confirm a report. Literally, that's what happened. Supreme Court vacates the Fifth Circuit judgment against her, sends it back for reconsideration in light of a previous case it decided on behalf of a pretty regular person, a 70-something town council member who had been subject to a malicious prosecution. So we are seeing these regular folks win, but if we want more regular folks participating, the public square has to be less like Gab. And for those who don't know what Gab is, it's the open sewer of the internet. It's a social media platform that Twitter looks decent by comparison.
Well, Francesca, you certainly threw out a lot, and I will only take time to respond to a couple of points, but please do follow up. So first of all, I know you're a law professor, as I am too. We are not supposed to fight the hypothetical, but I don't think you were putting it out there as a hypothetical, and I am not at all sure that if one did a statistical analysis of every recent First Amendment free speech case that the Supreme Court had, that it would consist of tech giants and corporations. I'm honestly not sure of that at all. And in fact, I thought of the very same case that David mentioned, because I thought, what is the most recent ruling the Supreme Court has issued on free speech? It was yesterday, and it was a fire case, and we won on behalf of not only the reporter who was trying to speak, and you could say, well, a reporter, she's powerful. But we always have to remember a point that was made by Salman Rushdie, that it is not only the freedom of the speaker, but it's the freedom of the reader or of the audience member. And so it's not only the freedom of this journalist to speak or of a tech giant to be free of improper government pressure that is at stake, but what's at stake is the right of every single one of us. When the ACLU won 9-0, the first Supreme Court case about the First Amendment in cyberspace, Reno versus ACLU, the Supreme Court, and we were defending freedom of whoever has power over the internet because of the ultimate beneficiaries, which is the fact that, as the Supreme Court said, this is the most participatory form of mass media that has ever existed. Back in the 20th century, A.J. Liebling famously quipped that freedom of press belongs to he who owns a printing press. Well, thanks to technology, all of us, I mean, almost, I can't say almost everybody in the world, but an unprecedentedly huge percentage of people in the world can, in fact, have the power of the printing press, but not if the government puts improper pressure on the centralized gatekeepers. We can certainly, I'm not an expert on the facts, but I think as a principled matter, there's some point where government encouragement and persuasion, which is completely appropriate, becomes inappropriate coercion. And the losers are not just Meta. The losers are the rest of us who are trying to get access to that platform. And I guess I would say the same thing. I think the reason why there tends to be this narrative that free speech has been, here's a verb I don't like, but the Supreme Court itself has used it. The First Amendment has been weaponized to propel certain views, and then you fill in the blank, whatever views or whatever speakers are disliked by the person who's using that negative terminology. But the fact of the matter is that the Supreme Court will use the vehicle of a particular case to enforce a particular principle, which then redounds to the benefit of every single speaker with every single perspective. The cases that do receive the most notoriety are not the cases of the type that David talked about. I think the most famous or infamous Supreme Court case is Citizens United. And even there, I mean, people imagine that the Supreme Court upheld freedom of speech for big, bad, multinational, evil corporations, right? The statute that the Supreme Court upheld equally protected the same free speech rights, not only for for-profit large corporations, but for not-for-profit small corporations. You know, the vast majority who are covered are like mom-and-pop businesses. And labor unions, we never hear about that. That labor unions, voices of the people, are equally empowered by that decision. So I think there's a lot of disinformation about what the Supreme Court has actually held, and is part of the reason why my most recent book, this is not an advertisement for the book, but if you want to buy it, that's fine, but it's part of an Oxford University press series called What Everyone Needs to Know, and amazingly enough, there wasn't one about free speech. And the reason why why I leapt at the opportunity to write that book was I find that so much of the opposition, which is the cultural problem that we've been talking about, hostility, ignorance toward free speech, or worse yet, hostility toward it, results from a caricatured, distorted version of what free speech actually is. You know, as law professors, we never indoctrinate our students. We don't advocate. We educate. But I have found that more people are educated about what free speech actually is, the history that gave rise to it, how awful censorship was for the social justice that our students wonderfully, and from my perspective, are crusading for, the more supportive they become.
No, it's actually one of the most beautiful and surprising things that I encounter every First Amendment class I teach is how my students are shocked that our free speech tradition is, you know, within our or our parents' lifetime, that we did not have actual, like this the idea, like, oh, it's so American, like it was American like since the 60s, and we've had many setbacks even since then along the way. And it's wonderful. What a victory culturally. So that's where I want to turn right now to the culture piece of this. I mean, give me the PR for free speech any day. I mean, I don't know how, well, some people are sitting on this stage and in this room for how this happened. But this real belief that it is core to who we are, when in reality, it's quite a novel part of our culture when you think about our entire history. Simultaneously, so I had the great fortune to teach my first couple First Amendment classes alongside Floyd Abrams, and it was wonderful. So Floyd and I played good cop, bad cop on free speech. It was great. And Floyd, who had been teaching for obviously many more years than I had, witnessed a decline in our students' appreciation for what his vision of free speech, I will say. There are obviously different visions of free speech. And I think the students pushed back and said, no, actually, we love free speech, right? It's part of it's rooted in us, it's American. But our free speech entails opening up the space, creating the word safety was used, creating a safer space, creating, they use different words to describe it, but I think we all know what I'm talking about. Spaces where you could encourage dissent in a way that was less dangerous or felt less dangerous to the students. And that's a double-edged sword, right? And so from Floyd's perspective, I think I'm not putting words in his mouth, sorry, Floyd, if I am, but he saw more of a reluctance on the students to actually engage. And so I want to bring back to one of the first things you all said, which was, that things are getting better culturally. Pair that with sort of my observation of my own students that, do love free speech, but actually are quite hesitant to allow a robust free speech as we might term free speech. How do you square that circle? And, the last thing I'll put out there for you all to respond with, take what you want and run from it. I think they are much more worried about the censors that affect them. And the censors that affect them are platforms, teachers, university presidents, bosses, and not really the government. And while we might have a history of government censorship, and certainly, anti-CRT laws, we're seeing lots of small government censorship. I think that the younger generation is feeling like the real cultural problem here are sort of titans of industry and more to the culture point, right? That censorship is never good. No one likes the word censorship, but regulation, restraint, limits can be good and can foster free speech. Do you agree with my observation, and what would you say to those who share it?
So I definitely agree that a lot of students you encounter, although this is diminishing in my experience a bit, but especially if you rewound the clock to the late 20-teens, even a couple of years ago, I heard a lot more talk about I don't want this discomfort we don't want discomfort. And I think that that's actually pulling, and previous panel mentioned it briefly, it's really, that's coming from deep, deep, deep cultural issues regarding the way we raise our kids. And I'm gonna tell on my own generation here. This is the Gen X's fault, guys, so I'm gonna go ahead and public apologize. So we Gen Xers by modern standards, you might call us like the last unparented generation. In the sense, even my parents, like my parents, they were strict, and their strictness was I had to have dinner at home and I had a curfew. Other than that, there was no strictness. I had free reign of everything and free reign in dealing with, my peers. I was a latchkey kid. And you grow up learning how to deal with discomfort and conflict on a peer-to-peer basis. And Greg Lukianoff and Jonathan Haidt in the Coddling of the American Mind, they talk about this change on how young were you when you went out for the first time all on your own, no parental supervision at all. And so for me, that might be 7 or 8 years old. But in my generation of parenting, we tried to replicate that with our kids. And other parents, we had to warn other parents. We give our kids the run of the neighborhood. And sometimes they would say, would you not? When my kid's over there, would you not? And so what we've done is we've taken a generation of younger people, in many ways overcorrecting for perhaps a feeling of abandonment that we had, or some of the more negative aspects of latchkey kid culture, which there were some. We've sort of overcorrected, and we've created a hyper-managed childhood. We've all heard about the helicopter parenting, the snowplow parenting, that consistently teaches kids that when they feel discomfort, appeal to an authority. When you feel discomfort, appeal to an authority. That's become a habit that has been ingrained. Discomfort, make an appeal, not discomfort and deal with it. And we've begun to order education around that demand as well. And we've forgotten some wisdom from the onset of what you rightly note is the very modern era of free speech in the United States. And I believe it was Justice Brennan in Pico versus Island Trees School District. This was a case about a book banning effort. Nothing new under the sun. Read the facts of that case, and it's ripped out of 2021. My goodness. But it's about a book banning effort, gets up to the Supreme Court, and Brennan says this that's really powerful. The purpose of an education is to prepare students to prepare students to become citizens in the pluralistic, often contentious society in which they live. So if your education is not, in addition to teaching reading, writing, arithmetic, is not also teaching people to participate in a contentious, pluralistic society, we're failing our kids. And we're failing our kids at that early, so that by the time they get to college, they're fully primed to appeal to administrators, fully primed to appeal to authority, to silence speech that they don't like. And so there's a lot of unlearning that has to take place on college campuses. And then I think there's some unlearning that, speaking of culture, has to take place with parents, people like me, that we have to be, comfortable with some of our kids' discomfort. And that goes against a lot of our instincts now.
Yeah, so you picked up on that wonderful theme that Amna and Musa raised in the last panel. And what I was thinking when I was listening to all three of you was Abu Patel recently had a wonderful column, I think in Inside Higher Ed. Of course, he's the founder of Interfaith America, and he talked about the value of pluralism. And I think that's what it is. Yes, you voice it through discourse, which can be debate and contention. Some of us have advocated, and there are books that have been written in the last couple of years, debate-centered education, where we start at the earliest age, what I demand, and I assume you and Floyd demand of your students as well, which is to be able to understand, articulate, and advocate all plausible perspectives on all issues. And I find a virtue in that approach is not only stimulating critical inquiry and the habits of a free mind, but also it divorces the students from personally identifying with a perspective so they can feel emboldened to voice perspectives that they might be shy of saying, this is my own thought for fear of being criticized. But to answer a couple of points beyond the ones that David answered so well, Francesca, I think that meaningful freedom of speech has to be more than just the negative approach of the First Amendment. Congress or government shall make no law, abridging the freedom of speech. But for those of us who are really committed to, all fundamental freedoms for all people and see liberty and equality and human rights as being inextricably intertwined, we cannot have meaningful freedom of speech until everybody is empowered equally to enjoy and exercise their free speech rights. That's why I feel so passionate about keeping the internet free, because it has come the closest that we have yet come to making that realistically possible. It's why I care so much about education and making sure that we do everything we can for every member of our society from the earliest of ages to have the educational resources, to have the technological resources, to have the psychological resources to be able to actually enjoy their liberty, that it exists not only in theory and in reality. And another part of that you also touched on in another one of your questions, Francesca, and that is the limits on free speech. As a result of the recent controversies over the past year or so, I have become much more aware and conscious than I was in the past that if we are to enjoy meaningful, robust freedom of speech, vibrant, equal discourse to all people and all perspectives, not only must government and universities not suppress constitutionally protected speech, they must also not allow expression that is not constitutionally protected, not to mention expressive conduct, such as actual assaults, which some people are saying, oh, but that expresses my viewpoint. No. And so I think it's a difficult line to draw. I agree, and I'm very nervous if Title VI is enforced by it should not be enforced by Title VI requires the universities to take steps to redress any hostile environment harassment on the basis of group identities, including national origin and religion and ethnic origin. It's concerning to me that some people are arguing that controversial expressions in the war of words over the Middle Eastern situation, some people are saying, well, that's creating a hostile environment. If I hear people chanting anti-Palestinian or anti-Israeli statements, that should not be punished. But if it goes beyond that to targeted harassment or bullying or stalking or intimidation of a particular individual or group of individuals, not to mention the physical assaults that have been reported, that must be punished. And likewise, there must be a consistent enforcement of, we've now all heard these phrases thanks to recent debates, content-neutral time, place, and manner regulations. I keep hearing reports that I don't know, I haven't done factual investigations, but I hear disturbing allegations that these limits are not in fact being enforced in a way that will make a library or an administration building or an area of campus that should be open to all students, in fact, not open because certain demonstrators, it doesn't even matter what they're saying, they have taken it over and are preventing it from being used for its designated educational purpose.
That's great. Well, I'm going to ask you all one final question while I invite anyone who wants to ask questions to the microphones. We have about 11 minutes left, so please make your way if you would like. You've both touched on the necessity of how limits can actually expand speech, and the real trouble right now with what are those limits and who draws them. So that might be the summary of the state of free speech in America today, right? A recognition on both sides that we need some limits, but what are they and who should draw them? So speaking of both sides, I would like to ask you both from sort of different sides of the aisle, speaking to your respective communities that you often speak to, conservative on the one, more conservative on the one hand, more progressive on the other. Your kind of 1 minute elevator pitch for why everyone knows we've talked about, both sides here hold the mantle of free speech and tend to and have done things that I think we would all agree are quite abusive to free speech. To those, what do you think is the most convincing argument to your respective ilks that to come back and enforce? Just most briefly, and then I'm happy to take questions.
Yeah, if I had one word for sort of right-wing revolutionaries, I would say, after the swords are drawn, you're foolish to think you're going to win. That what I've seen happen on the right is, if you rewind the clock about 25 years ago, there was a lot of unanimity on the right around free speech, especially free speech on campus. We're a free speech movement. We're a free speech movement. And then when cases were won and won and won and won and won and won, and college speech codes began to be struck down, the right then began to split between those of us who said, moving back to legal equality, that's what we wanted. Liberty, that's what we wanted. Between those folks, and I would count myself in that faction, and then another one that's like, no, that's the rest stop on the way to authority. So if you felt like you were being censored, well, step one is to achieve legal parity and legal equality. Then step two is to gain authority and power. And this is when you began to see like the rise of the anti-CRT laws, completely, the Stop Woke Law Act in Florida, completely opposite of the free speech argument that a lot of folks had made on the right. And, a lot of it driven by hardcore Christian nationalist figures who really have microscopic constituencies. If you're leading a microscopic religious movement, the argument to 300 million people that religious folks should rule is not the argument you think you're making, because you're not going to be the one. And so I think we cannot abandon the principled argument for free speech. And that's the one I always lead with, it's the principled argument. That's the, best short argument I've ever read is Frederick Douglass's plea for free speech in Boston. Make the principled argument, but don't back away from the pragmatic argument that this isn't just wrong, but it's also incredibly foolish. And history is littered with the bodies of revolutionaries who thought they were going to rule when they upset the liberal order.
I would make exactly the same argument, David, right? Because freedom of speech, along with all of our individual liberties, were deliberately designed to be a check against the potential tyranny of the majority. And in every period in history, there are at least some communities, even if not the nation as a whole, where liberals and progressives and social justice activists are going to be in the minority. Indeed, if you look at all the movements for social change and social justice in this country, starting with, the abolitionists and the civil rights movement and the women's suffrage movement and the gay rights, on and on and on. They started as tiny embattled minorities who gradually, ultimately persuaded majorities or significant individuals or political figures to adopt their perspectives. Martin Luther King made so many wonderful statements about this, one of which was that freedom of speech is the most important right because it gives us the right to advocate for all other rights.
Amazing. So I'm going to do something slightly unconventional here because we have about 6 minutes. Can I please take all, I see 3 people at the mics. Can I take all 3 of your questions? Just if you wouldn't mind trying to be as brief as possible, and then I can turn it over to you all to have the last word and respond in kind. That way I can get you all in. When we start here.
Thank you for being here. It's delightful to listen and think about what you've been talking about, despite the fact it's way too philosophical for me most of the time, freedom of speech. If you had a magic wand, what would you change to improve the culture wars, et cetera, et cetera? And I don't mean a goal. I mean, what would you change? For me, I would outlaw cell phones below the age of 8. For sake of talk, I would force the tech giants to do whatever the experts think ought to be done to get rid of all the violence that's on the internet. Okay?
Wonderful. Okay, magic wand question. Let's go over here.
Thank you very much for the panel for this. Just one question for David. Your one-third, two-third problem you portray as a cultural question, the toxification of our public commons. I want to push back on that and suggest that it is actually inherent in the business model of the tech giants, of the platforms, that the algorithms are configured to amplify outland. And because of that, therefore, that I want to suggest I want to contest the notion that it is a cultural problem. What is your response to the idea or to the suggestion that's actually an economic model and a business model of the tech platforms?
Good. We like to call that the law and economics question. Wonderful. And our last question.
A simple legal question that, in a way, was just raised, but not fully articulated. Might there be some beneficial effect on the difficult speech problems raised by tech giants and their possession of First Amendment rights if the antitrust laws, as they're beginning to be in Europe, were much more strictly enforced on the tech giants?
All right. Magic wand, the economic model, and should antitrust be the solution? And anything else you want to say?
I'll go with the pushback. I think there's no doubt that the algorithms are economically motivated algorithms. I mean, I don't think there's any question about that. But I also think that's very linked to culture. You know, we often look at the big tech and the tech giants as if we're seeing something we've never seen before and creating and free speech and cultural challenges we've never seen before. But we've seen a lot of this before. You know, there's this phrase involving local media that I've heard my entire life. If it bleeds, it leads. Okay, and so my whole life, I've been around people who said, why is media highlighting such violent things? Why does the media highlight A, B, C, and D? Why doesn't media do E, F, and G? Well, now that I'm a member of the media, I know the answer. Let me let you in on a secret. Because the people watch the toxic stuff. And then they'll tell you, why don't you report on good news? And I'll say, you know what? We do. No, I never see it. I know you don't. Because you don't care, you don't look at it, you don't read it. And so we do have a problem. The economics, yes, I completely agree that the tech giants and some of the algorithmically driven content is problematic. But it's also being driven and fed to us for a very good reason, and that is what we're demanding to be fed to us. And so that's why I just think we can't escape the cultural piece.
Yeah, and I'd like to chime in on that if I can, because we always tend to, I agree with David, and even further back in history, I can tell you it was always, okay, boomers, right? Even way back then, it was, if it bleeds, it leads. But there's also another pattern which I see replicated throughout my crusading for free speech, and that is to blame the media for whatever social or political ill is out there. It must be, in my parents' generation, it was TV. I wasn't allowed to watch TV as a kid because they thought that would be a really bad influence. And then subsequently we had violent video games were being blamed for the first school shootings. And earlier, before my lifetime, comic books were being blamed for what was then quaintly called juvenile delinquency. And people tend to assume that the cause and effect relationship is the media algorithms or images are pushing us to look toward these antisocial depictions. But in fact, it's we consumers who do have the power. And this was tested recently by a study. I think you can even find it on the website of Future Free Speech. If you have trouble finding it, contact me and I'll send you a link. But a study that was done by eminent social scientists from 5 different universities in the United States, the UK, Europe, and they did a test that looked at what choices people would make if they were making their independent choices not driven by algorithms at all. So it was a blind study. It is true that people using the algorithms tend to become more and more extreme in what they look at. And guess what the study showed? It showed that when not guided by algorithms, when making their own free choices, people became even more extreme, and that the algorithms, in fact, had a moderating influence. So I think there's a lot of so-called conventional wisdom about how evil some of these platforms are, and there's a lot of room that social scientists and other experts are now moving into to find out what the facts are so that we can more effectively harness the power of these companies and the expression to do more good than harm.
You could basically sum up consumer anger at media, and I'm not saying media is perfect, but we make mistakes. But a lot of it is, stop giving me what I want. and then you stop giving them what you want. Oh, I'm bored by that. I'm not going to watch that anymore. I mean, it's just, this is the constant pattern.
Just we're out of time, so just in a sentence, just to get to magic wand, what would you guys change?
Here's my magic one. I want to change one idea that is so destructive to free speech in this country right now, and the idea that free speech is at odds with diversity and inclusion. That is fundamentally wrong. American history shows it's fundamentally wrong. Was America more just or less just before 1923 when the First Amendment wasn't incorporated to the states?
And I would require that historical fact as well as the history and principles of free speech to be part of the mandatory education curriculum starting at the very earliest ages, pre-K.
Said like a professor. Thank you all. Please join me in thanking Nadine Strossen and David Brent.